In the midst of a deeply personal segment on his television show, Steve Harvey became the recipient of a startling and poignant message from Ibrahim Traoré, the President of Burkina Faso. The communication, laden with reverence, esteem, and unvarnished feeling, took the host completely by surprise, compelling him to shed tears on a live broadcast. This exceptional and moving occurrence resonated with millions of viewers, as two prominent men engaged in a profound, unscripted exchange of emotions. Steve Harvey emerged onto the set of his talk show, his face adorned with its customary broad smile. As the audience's applause and cheers subsided, Steve, brimming with his typical vitality, delved into the scheduled subject for the day, the influence of having a purpose. It was slated to be a standard part of the program. He had just concluded an anecdote from his own life, detailing his early hardships with poverty. When a member of the production crew hastily approached the stage, murmuring something into Steve's ear, his expression shifted from confusion to astonishment, then to quiet contemplation. Turning to face the audience and cameras, he cleared his throat and announced, "Well, folks, it seems I've just been informed of a very unique message intended for me, and it originates from a place I would have never imagined, Burkina Faso." The large screen positioned behind him illuminated, displaying a golden emblem and the stark text, "A message from President Ibrahim Traoré." A profound hush fell over the studio. Not a single word, not even a cough, could be heard. Steve, now discernible, unsettled, gazed into the camera and uttered softly, "Why on earth would the President of Burkina Faso be sending a message to me? I have no idea what this is even about." He took a seat, his gaze fixed upon the screen. As the video commenced, the footage started with a serene, inviting setting, a modest wooden desk with the flag of Burkina Faso positioned behind it. A man with intense eyes and a gentle demeanor then came into view. President Ibrahim Traoré. Steve instinctively leaned closer, his grip on the arms of his chair growing tighter. Mr. Steve Harvey, the president, started speaking English with a subtle African inflection. "I am addressing you not merely as a head of state, but as a fellow brother." Everyone in the studio audience leaned forward, captivated. "You are not familiar with me, but we are certainly familiar with you," Traoré went on. "In the hamlets of Burkina Faso, your voice travels much further than you might realize. Your affirmations of fortitude, belief, and the opportunity for a new beginning have impacted individuals you will never have the chance to meet." Steve blinked, utterly dumbfounded. A slight tremor began in his hands. Traoré's voice grew thick with feeling. "During our most desperate times, as conflict posed a threat to our tranquility, it was your personal story that offered me hope. You served as a reminder that true leadership isn't defined by official titles, but by one's purpose and the condition of one's heart." The room descended into complete and utter silence. Then Traoré stared straight into the camera's lens, declaring, from a soldier who ascended to guide his nation to a boy who started with nothing in America, "I extend my gratitude." Steve's lips moved, but no sound escaped. All that emerged was the beginning of tears. For the first time in many years, Steve Harvey found himself without words. He fumbled for a tissue as the message proceeded. "I have observed you weeping for others, sharing laughter with people you've just met, and offering help to those who felt they had been forgotten." Traoré's voice resonated. "In my homeland, we recognize that sort of spirit. We describe it as a heart of the sun-warm, courageous, and a source of light for all." Steve finally managed to whisper, "Wow." The president paused briefly before adding, "This message is not a political gesture. It is a personal one. In you, I see the narrative of a man who refused to surrender, and that inspires me to never surrender on behalf of my people." The message concluded with Traoré speaking a phrase in Moor, the indigenous language of Burkina Faso. Steve turned to his production crew, his voice breaking. "What was it he said at the end?" A nearby translator rose and responded softly. He said, "Even the most resilient man must be reminded that his voice continues to hold significance." Steve buried his face in his hands. The audience was overcome with tears. Even the camera operator's hands were unsteady. This was more than a television spectacle. It was a communion of souls bridging oceans, shared hardships, and a sense of brotherhood. And it was far from over. Steve remained seated in quiet reflection, his hands clasped and his eyes shining with moisture. The audience waited patiently, but he was unable to speak. A profound weight had settled upon his spiritual weight of authenticity, of human connection, of being truly seen. After a moment, Steve looked toward the camera and said, "You know, you never really imagined that your words could travel so far. You're just doing your best to be authentic, to get by, to be of service." The audience offered a gentle round of applause, but Steve raised a hand to quiet them. "This isn't for applause," he stated. "This is about purpose." Behind the scenes, the producers were considering a break for commercials, but Steve would not allow it. "I want everyone to witness every moment of this. Keep the cameras rolling." Then, as the cameras focused closely on Steve, a second surprise unfolded: a live feed. The screen behind him flickered to life. Suddenly, President Ibrahim Traoré was there on video. This time in real time, Steve gasped. "Mr. Harvey," Traoré said, his smile gentle. "For a change, allow me to address you, man to man. Not as one nation to another, but as one dreamer too." Another? The studio was once again enveloped in silence. A tempest of emotion was gathering, and no one was prepared for the president's next words. Traoré leaned closer to his camera, his voice soft and genuine. "You perceive me today as a president," he stated, "but I was once a boy without shoes. I made my way to school barefoot. My books were held together with a piece of string. And on many nights, hunger was my companion as I went to sleep." Steve bowed his head, his shoulders shaking as he fought back a fresh wave of tears. The president went on, "As a young man, I witnessed war firsthand. I saw individuals lose all hope, but I also saw others find the strength to rise." He paused, then revealed something astonishing. "One afternoon, in a busy internet cafe, I came across a video of you. Don't give up. I couldn't grasp all of your words, but I understood your tears, your fervor, your suffering, and your hope." Steve looked up, utterly amazed. "You inspired a young boy in Burkina Faso to believe he could transcend his circumstances, and I am that boy." The audience let out a collective gasp. Tears were now flowing freely down many faces. Traoré smiled tenderly. "So, upon hearing your voice again just last week, as you spoke about purpose, I felt it was my time to respond." Steve shielded his face with his hands. And it was then that Traoré uttered a statement that even Steve found incredible. President Traoré inhaled deeply, then locked his gaze with the camera. "Mr. Harvey," he began, "you once expressed a desire to visit Africa, not merely as a public figure, but as a brother, as an individual eager to contribute." Steve nodded, murmuring, "Yes, I did say that." "Well," Traoré smiled, "I wish to extend a personal invitation for you to come to Burkina Faso, not for media coverage, not for public acclaim, but to witness for yourself what your voice has silently cultivated." The studio audience gasped in amazement. "You have uplifted spirits across continents. Now, permit me to show you the seeds of hope you've sown in our nation's soil." Steve's hands were trembling. He was caught between speaking and crying. Then came the words that finally broke his composure. "There is a small orphanage in Ouagadougou. The children who live there are familiar with your name. They incorporate your words into their prayers. They find joy in your humor. But most importantly, they have come to believe they are significant because you yourself are significant." Steve rose to his feet, his eyes flooded with tears. The audience stood with him, their applause soft, with many dabbing at their own eyes. But Traoré had more to say. He looked into the lens and added, "In 7 days' time, they will convene in the village square, anticipating the arrival of the man whose words journeyed across oceans to mend their hearts." The countdown was now underway. The very next morning, Steve was already in the process of packing. There were no camera crews, no press releases. It was just him, a single piece of luggage, and a mind teeming with questions. The story was spreading globally. Every major news network featured headlines like, "President of Burkina Faso brings Steve Harvey to tears," and a message that spanned continents. But Steve's journey wasn't for the world's attention. He was going for those children. For that voice that had spoken directly to his soul. As his aircraft traversed the Atlantic, he gazed out the window, his thoughts drifting back to his own youth. He recalled growing up in poverty in Cleveland, the evenings when there was no food, the periods when his ambitions felt impossibly large. And here he was, flying to Africa, summoned by a president who had endured similar struggles. He whispered to himself, "Lord, why have you chosen me?" He had no idea what he would find. Would the children even know who he was? Would he possess the fortitude to meet them? Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, President Traoré stood before a gathering of children. In a sun-drenched courtyard, he smiled and announced, "He is on his way." The children erupted in joyful shouts, but one small girl at the back had tears in her eyes. She clutched a little notebook. Inside, she had penned a letter to Steve Harvey. Her name was Aïcha. She was just 10, small in stature, with a quiet voice and a wisdom that belied her age. In her grasp, the notebook quivered as she whispered to her caregiver, "Do you think he'll read it? Will it matter to him?" The caregiver smiled, kneeling down to her level. "He has already shown more care than most people ever do." Aïcha's letter was brief, yet it contained an entire world of hardship. "Dear Mr. Steve, my name is Aïcha. My father passed away 2 years ago. My mother is unwell. There are nights I cry, but then one day someone showed us your video. You said you were destined for something great. I took your words to heart. Thank you for speaking to us, even though you were unaware we were listening. I hope you smile when you meet us. Your little sister Aïcha." As the sun dipped below the horizon in Ouagadougou, children rehearsed songs, others drew pictures featuring his name. An atmosphere of hope was palpable, but Aïcha remained silent, seated by a mango tree, her notebook held tightly to her chest. In that instant, this was not about celebrity or international relations. It was about a man who had once been homeless, living in his car, coming to meet a child who often went to bed hungry, and the heavens themselves seemed to murmur. Their paths were always meant to cross. The airplane landed on a sun-scorched runway just past noon. Steve Harvey emerged, using his hand to shield his eyes from the intense sunlight. There was no press corps, no elaborate reception, just a handful of guards, 2 interpreters, and a young assistant holding a simple sign. "Welcome, Brother Steve." His heart began to beat more rapidly. Inside a nearby vehicle, he was transported through the city streets. He saw modest houses, bustling little markets, and children who waved as his van went by. When they arrived at the orphanage gates, he was unprepared for the sight that greeted him. More than 100 children were assembled, holding signs they had made themselves with messages like, "You are important, thank you, Mr. Steve, and we love you." Tears immediately welled in his eyes. President Traoré came forward, dressed not in a formal suit, but in a simple white shirt and traditional attire. He embraced Steve in a tight hug. "Welcome to your home," he said. Steve was at a loss for words. Then a small voice cried out from the gathering, "Steve, Steve!" It was Aïcha. She approached him cautiously, her notebook held in her trembling hands. She held it out to him. "This is for you," she whispered. He knelt down, opened her letter, and read it in silence. And then he began to weep, openly and without restraint. And every person present understood that this was not merely a visit. It was a divinely orchestrated meeting. Backstage, during a brief interlude for commercials, Steve was seated perfectly still. The broadcast of President Ibrahim Traoré's message had just concluded. A producer came to him, holding a sheet of paper. It was a complete English translation of the president's words. "Steve, you're going to want to see this part," she whispered, handing it to him. Steve's eyes drifted over the text. "When I was a small boy, hiding beneath the wooden table of my grandmother's stall in the market, I would hear her chuckle as she listened to your voice on a staticky radio. She spoke no English, but your spirit brought a smile to her face during difficult times. That voice was part of my upbringing." Steve brought a hand to his mouth, his own voice cracking. "Oh my goodness." The cameras were live again, but Steve could not feign a smile. He looked directly into the lens and whispered, "This world. It's so much more connected than we realize, and our words, they carry farther than we could ever fathom." He wiped away a tear as the audience sat in a state of stunned silence. Steve had no inkling that this was merely the prelude to something far more significant. The segment concluded. Steve left the stage, the letter still in his hand. He was scheduled to proceed with the next guest, but an internal force compelled him otherwise. He entered his dressing room, phone in hand, and called his producer. "I need a connection to Ouagadougou. I need to speak with President Traoré today." The producer, taken aback, stammered, "Certainly, sir. I'll get on that immediately." 2 hours later, a secure video link was established, and there he was, President Ibrahim Traoré, composed and humble, his eyes reflecting both the burden of a nation and the warmth of a brother. Steve looked at him, his voice unsteady. "Mr. President, I'm just a comedian from Cleveland. I never dreamed my voice could ever reach a person like you." Traoré offered a gentle smile. "And I am just a soldier with a deep love for his people. But hope is a necessity. You provided me with that. Now I wish to offer something in return." Steve leaned forward. "What is it you mean?" Traoré said softly. "Come to Burkina Faso for just a single day. There is someone I want you to meet." Steve was frozen. He had no way of knowing that this one sentence was about to alter the course of his life. Steve hardly slept that night. The president's invitation replayed endlessly in his mind. Yet it was a single line from the letter that truly resonated. With him, that voice was part of my upbringing. He was reminded of his own mother, the woman who had instilled in him the belief that he could amount to something. Steve also recalled something else. Years prior, during a particularly challenging phase of his career, he had prayed, "God, if you ever grant me fame, let my words hold meaning for someone who is genuinely in need." And now, this had happened. That evening, Steve initiated a short live stream, not to deliver jokes or a monologue, but to share a truth he could no longer contain. He held the translated letter up to the camera. "You all know I've been blessed with fame, wealth, and success, but this message from a leader I've never met. This letter about a boy raised by a grandmother who couldn't understand my words, but could feel my spirit. That is a divine act." He paused. "I made a promise once, and I intend to honor it." Steve made his choice then and there. He was going to Burkina Faso, not for the sake of television or ratings, but for a purpose infinitely more profound. Steve boarded the private jet to Ouagadougou with a sense of gravity and an open heart. This was his inaugural trip to Burkina Faso. He brought no film crew, no journalists, just his personal assistant, an interpreter, and a single journal that had been untouched for years. As the aircraft descended, Steve sat by the window, rereading the translated letter. He had underlined one sentence in red, "I wish my mother could have witnessed the man you helped me to become." The words echoed in his thoughts like a melody. He leaned his head back and whispered, "What have I done to be worthy of such an honor?" Midway through the flight, his assistant gave him a small envelope sealed with wax. It was from President Traoré. Within was a handwritten message. "Upon your arrival, do not think as a celebrity. Think as a son returning home." Steve held the note to his chest. He was uncertain of what lay ahead, but he felt a deep sense of conviction that this journey was about more than one man's expression of gratitude. It was about healing a wound buried deep within them both, something no camera had ever captured. Steve reached Burkina Faso just as the day was breaking. The airport was tranquil. There were no throngs of people, no reporters, only a convoy of 2 black SUVs and a tall soldier positioned near the door. President Ibrahim Traoré himself. Steve descended the aircraft steps slowly, unsure of what to say, but Traoré approached and did something unforeseen. He embraced him as if he were a long-lost brother. There were no words, only a prolonged, silent hug. Steve's eyes welled with tears. "You came," Traoré said with simplicity. "I had to," Steve answered. They journeyed in silence through the dusty roads. Children waved from the side of the road, some holding signs they had drawn with Steve's name on them. But their initial destination was not the presidential palace. It was a small, time-worn market with rows of wooden tables displaying fruits, spices, and fabrics. Traoré guided Steve to the very rear. "This," he said, gesturing to a collapsed stall, "belonged to my grandmother. This is the very spot where I listened to you on the radio while I helped her count her earnings." Steve looked down at the ground, rendered speechless. The president knelt, picked up a small stone, and placed it into Steve's hand. This is where the hope was born. Steve could no longer contain his emotions. He wept in silence, and Traoré wept with him. Traoré then led Steve to a modest village, an hour's drive from the capital. As their vehicle came to a halt, a group of women were waiting beneath a tree. One of them, elderly and moving with difficulty, came forward, her hands trembling. "This is Aïcha," Traoré explained. "She is the last living person who used to sit with my grandmother on market days. She remembers you." Steve appeared puzzled. "But how?" Traoré smiled. "They could not comprehend your English, but they could feel your happiness. AWA used to say that man possesses a heart that speaks more loudly than his words." Aïcha came closer. The interpreter softly relayed her words. "You made the difficult days seem more bearable. My sister," referring to his grandmother, used to say your voice gave her the strength to continue selling when she felt like giving up." Steve knelt, tears streaming down his face once more. Aïcha touched his cheek and whispered something gently in more. The interpreter's voice caught as she translated. She says, "My sister would have made sure you were fed if she had ever met you. She would have called you her son." In that moment, Steve Harvey was not a famous entertainer. He was a son being welcomed home by a mother he never realized he had, and a world observed, speechless. That evening, Steve was a guest at a small school where children were waiting to give a special performance. There were no cameras or stage lights, only the soft beat of drums and the nervous expressions of small children. As Steve walked in, the children began to sing a simple melody in Moor, the local dialect. The interpreter leaned close and whispered, "It is a song President Traoré's grandmother would hum while she cooked at her market stall. These children now sing it to honor her memory." Steve stood frozen. It was the same tune he had found himself humming days before, without understanding why. Tears filled his eyes. "I know this," Steve whispered. "My own grandmother in Cleveland. She would hum a song just like this when I was sad." Traoré stood at his side, his arms folded calmly. "Our grandmothers offered us the same solace. From thousands of miles away." Steve sat on a dusty bench, encircled by the children. A young girl presented him with a wooden carving of two hands cradling a heart. He broke down completely, weeping loudly, releasing years of pain and questions in a place he never anticipated. The boy from Ohio and the boy from Ouagadougou, now two men, had discovered a connection that no script could ever capture. The world no longer saw two celebrities. It saw two sons who missed their grandmothers. Before Steve's flight back, President Traoré requested one final meeting, this time on a small piece of land just outside the city. It was a peaceful spot. A single tree stood at its center, surrounded by sunflowers. Traoré handed Steve a rolled-up certificate, fastened with a red ribbon. "This land," he declared, "is now yours. It is a place of serenity, a gift from the people of Burkina Faso, so that whenever you feel weary or lost, you have a home to return to here." Steve shook his head slowly, overwhelmed. "I did not come here for a gift. I came because your letter made me feel like a human being again." Traoré nodded. "And you made my people feel as though they were seen. That is more valuable than any amount of gold." They stood in silence beneath the tree, the wind gently grazing their faces. Then Traoré did something no one would have predicted. He knelt and laid his hand upon Steve's chest. "I do not kneel for many," he said, "but I kneel for the hearts that transform lives." Steve too sank to his knees. And there, together, two influential men cried like small boys who longed for their grandmothers and had found solace in each other's pain. The next day, Steve's arrival back in the United States was met with quietude. He had requested no fanfare, no media, no spectacle, but a change had occurred within him. On his next broadcast before the show began, Steve walked onto the stage carrying the wooden carving. The children had given him one with two hands holding a heart. He placed it carefully on his desk. Then he looked into the camera. "In my lifetime, I have been given many awards, many presents, but nothing compares to this." His voice cracked. "I met a man, a president, not just of a nation, but of the human spirit." Ibrahim Traoré reminded me of a truth I had forgotten, that love, honor, and memory are more powerful than anything fame can offer. He paused. "He called me a son of Africa. I call him my brother." And then Steve did something unprecedented. He played a recording of the children's song live on air. There was no translation, just the sound of pure, innocent voices. Millions of people watched, and millions of them cried. Comments poured in from every part of the globe. People weren't seeing politics. They were seeing love. They were seeing legacy. They were seeing healing. Dear viewers, if this narrative has moved you in any way, however small, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment below with a single word, healed. Let us work together to share this sentiment with the entire world. One story, one tear, one heart at a time.